today, I want you to listen for a few words that tie into the Easter resurrection story. The words have to do with tending. You did not hear the word in this particular passage in John chapter 20. It appears in the next chapter, 21. But we'll make a connection where tend, tenderly, and tenderness are part of the Easter story. Tend, to care for, to watch over, to look after, to give one's attention to. Tenderly, with gentleness, kindness, affection. Tenderness, a feeling of concern, gentle affection, or warm, compassionate feelings. As you listen, think about the things, the places, and the people that you tend in your life. Who tends you? Who tends to you? How does God tend to you? In what ways? How do we attend to God? Where do you notice tenderness in your life? Either giving it or receiving it. And some of you who like to count and want to have something to focus on, you may just want to start counting how many times I use these words today, and then we can compare notes after the service is over. The week after my high school graduation, for reference, that was June 1985. I moved out of my house for various reasons that I won't go into right now. There was a family from my church who invited me to live with them this summer before my freshman year that I was going to start in the fall, just across the freeway, I-5, in Parkland, a place some of you might know, Pacific Lutheran University. In exchange for room and board with this family from my church, I would be a part-time nanny to tend to their 3 young children. They were 5 and twins who were 3 at the time. It just so happened that this family, they were the caretakers. They were the tenders of the local cemetery. And where did they live? In the cemetery. I went into the local DMV to renew my driver's license, and I listed a P.O. box as my address, but that would not do. They said they needed to have a physical address, but there wasn't a physical address for the cemetery. So I said, Fern Hill Cemetery. And they said, is that your permanent address? Yes. Yes, it is. It's my permanent address. I can't believe I've never preached that story before, but it's such a good story. Some of my friends thought it was weird to be living in a cemetery. We were teenagers. They told me that cemeteries are creepy, morose. I think they watched too many horror shows. I was not into horror films, and so I didn't know that I should be creeped out in a cemetery. And I actually found solace living in a cemetery, being surrounded by some of the people in my family, like my dad, who was buried there. I could visit him often, at least his grave. I enjoyed walking on the beautiful tree-lined road up the hill where there is a view where you can see for miles. And have you ever noticed that cemeteries always seem to have the best views? Cemeteries can provide a vital connection to loved ones, and they can be crucial places of deep healing and growth, comforting places to allow oneself to grieve, to remember, to tend the grave, to honor. And I'm sad to say that I haven't been back to Fern Hill Cemetery in probably 10 years. But I just met up with my cousins on my dad's side. They say they go every Memorial Day weekend, and they bring flowers to all of the aunties and uncles and parents, including my dad's grave. And I said, this Memorial Day weekend, I want to join you. And so I'm hoping to do that. This cemetery was also the one that hosted the annual Easter sunrise service. And it was the perfect place to greet the dawn. Well, I don't know, this morning in the apple orchard was absolutely the perfect place to greet the dawn, because the sun, we could see the sunrise. The sun always rises, but we could see it and witness it as 35 of us gathered in 37-degree weather. And it was beautiful. But the cemetery was a great place to greet the dawn as we gathered to shout, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed, as we were surrounded by the beauty of God's creation in a garden-like atmosphere. The summer before my freshman year in college, I not only tended the children of the family that took me in, but I also worked in the cemetery, tending to the grounds, mowing carefully around the markers, as well as tending compassionately to people who came to the cemetery office wanting to find out where a loved one was buried so they could honor, grieve, and remember. It was in a garden cemetery where Jesus had been placed in a tomb. There were those who tended the lifeless body of Jesus, as this was a sacred Jewish custom. In the Gospel of Luke, it is the women early in the morning who come to tend to Jesus' body. In the Gospel of John, it is Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus who prepare his body for burial in a sacred process known as aninut, A-N-I-N-U-T, a Hebrew word meaning deep sorrow. They wash and anoint Jesus' body with spices of myrrh and aloe and wrap him in linens and a prayer shawl. As was and is the Jewish custom, they would plan to sit Shiva for a week to grieve and to tend to one another's wounded hearts. Except that when Mary Magdalene arrived at the tomb to tend to the body of Jesus when the Sabbath was over, the body was gone. She runs all the way back to tell Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, and they all race to the tomb. But when the disciples see the body is gone, they simply leave. But Mary remains in the burial garden weeping. The Gospel of John moves through what I imagine is a myriad of unspoken emotions of disbelief, anxiety, fear, anger, disappointment, desolation, confusion, weeping. Did I leave any emotions out? And liminal space in these short 18 verses. We can imagine all of those feelings. And this all happens before Mary mistakes Jesus as a gardener tending to the garden and the tombs. It is only when Jesus calls her tenderly by name that Mary finally recognizes him as the risen Christ. In the next chapter, in John chapter 21, in another resurrection appearance, Jesus asks Peter, do you remember what he asked? Do you love me? It may feel like rubbing salt in Peter's wounds, reminding him of his recent betrayal of Jesus. but I think there is an element of tenderness, of gentle affection, as Jesus had with Mary in calling her by name. Jesus also calls Peter by name and then tells him, "Tend my sheep, feed my lambs." Back a few chapters in John chapter 10, Jesus had said, "I am the good shepherd." The good shepherd who tends his sheep, his flock. But in John 21, Jesus calls Peter to be a shepherd as well, to tend the sheep. Before the cross became the primary symbol of resurrection to represent Christianity around the 10th century, there were other symbols to represent the resurrection and early Christianity. And it's time to resurrect these symbols. Kenneth Bailey writes in his book, The Good Shepherd, a 1,000-year journey from Psalm 23 to the New Testament. He writes these words, "For hundreds of years, Christians embraced the symbols of the Good Shepherd, the fish and the vine. These are images found in the art in the Roman catacombs in the first 4 centuries after Jesus. The image of the Good Shepherd suggested the recovery of tending to lost sheep, offering tender care and protection, green pastures and still waters. The symbol of resurrection in Christianity is about tending, nurturing, feeding, caring for. Liturgical art from the oldest existing church buildings, dating from the 4th and 5th centuries, echoes the imagery from the earliest catacombs. I've never heard of the Catacomb of Priscilla, but I discovered it. It's one of the oldest vaults, one of the oldest catacombs, and it contains an early depiction of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Surrounding Jesus is imagery of paradise, including images of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with banquet trays of fruit, a symbol of paradise, of tending to the garden. Psalm 23 offers both of these images and symbols, the shepherd who tends the sheep and the green pastures of creation and paradise. In the 6th century apse mosaic at the Basilica of the Saint Apollinaire Nuovo Church in Classe, I may not be pronouncing all of these words correctly, so forgive me, 5 miles from Ravenna, Italy, there are 26 panels telling the life of Christ. The 10th panel is Simon of Cyrene carrying a cross. The next panel shows the angel and the 2 women at the tomb. Curiously, but significantly, there is no depiction of the crucifixion. In 2008, Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Parker, who was the president of Star King Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Berkeley, California, and also United Methodist pastor in this conference, they wrote this groundbreaking book, Saving Paradise: How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire. It's definitely worth reading, but it's a long slog. Their research showed that early Christians portrayed Christ in a garden, not on a cross. And we'll see. I have this, I think, ready to go. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. So this is in the Basilica in Ravenna, or close to Ravenna, at the Apollinaire, Saint Apollinaire Nuovo Church. And I will leave this up for a moment so you can have something else to gaze at besides me. Their research showed that early Christians portrayed Christ in a garden, not on a cross. Rebecca and Rita embarked on a research journey visiting catacombs and the oldest known churches in Istanbul, Rome, monasteries in northeast Turkey, and the Ravenna mosaics in Italy at St. Apollinaire. They could not find any images of Jesus on the cross before the 9th century. The primary images in these early churches showed Jesus as a child, Jesus as a youthful shepherd tending the sheep, a healer tending the sick, a teacher, and images of Jesus tending a garden paradise in a world marked by known rivers which identified the garden as existing in the here and now, this life. The most ancient depictions of Christianity joyously affirmed the earth as paradise. It wasn't until the 10th century that churches began to depict Jesus on a cross. Paradise was the dominant image of early Christian sanctuaries. In the early church, paradise was this world, not someplace beyond this life. Church walls were covered with pastoral landscapes, orchards, sparkling rivers filled with fish, lush meadows, sheep, birds, and flowers. This book demonstrates the progression of how the cross ultimately became the primary symbol of Christianity 1,000 years after the resurrection of Jesus, moving away from the symbols of the Good Shepherd and paradise as primary symbols, and placing a suffering Jesus on the cross instead. The short answer of why that happened is that Western Christianity focused on substitution atonement and redemption through violence with a crucifixion-centered salvation, changing its theology to justify war and domination during the Crusades in the late 10th century and beyond, replacing resurrection and life in this world, and abandoning its primary vocation of loving and tending and caring for the earth and one another. Early Christianity was not about personal salvation or the promise of life after death. It was about restoring paradise in this world by living justly, ethically, generously, and joyously, tending to one another and creation. It was the call of the prophets to restore paradise by doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. It was Jesus' mission to restore paradise. The kingdom is among you, is what Jesus said, right here, right now. In a world filled with so much tension and angst, bitterness, conflict, and war, we could use symbols in our faith that have to do with tending and tenderness. If someone asks you what your permanent address is, your response will probably not be Fern Hills Cemetery, as mine was 35 years ago, but it's close. Our permanent address is paradise, the garden of creation, where Jesus is tenderly calling your name, awakening you to resurrection power, and then asking you to tend his sheep. Our home is in God, whether on this beloved earth of paradise or in the paradise in the nearer presence of God after our death. Where do you notice tenderness in your life, either giving or receiving? May we experience the tender consolation and care of the resurrected Christ who calls our name, and continue to be shepherds hopefully good shepherds, tenderly tending to one another and God's creation in paradise. Happy Easter, my friends. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Alleluia. Our prayer hymn is the Hymn of Promise, and we were going to do a screen share of a video of that, but at this point, our choir will take over to sing this beloved hymn.